Hey, Jeannie.
Hi.
Hey, Randy. How you guys doing?
Morning, how are you?
Excellent. Excellent. How are y'all?
Fabulous.
Great.
Good. Dan just called me. He should be here in just a second. So we'll see him in a minute. But yeah, Jeannie, let's catch me up. How's life?
It's nutty here, dude. It's just, I don't know. It's one day at a time, one moment at a time for sure.
How's your graduation and everything?
Yeah. Like, so we're 2 days, Saturday is when she graduates, and it's just nuts. I mean, the entire, I feel like I just spent my entire morning helping her enroll in classes for, it's a lot. It's like, we've got college stuff going on and then high school stuff going on. So we're in the midst of all of it. And stress is running high on her end, which obviously I'm picking up on that. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to hold my shit together.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Let's see. Dan is saying he needs a password. Did you guys need that to join?
No. He might be trying to, sometimes that'll happen if he's logging in on the browser.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Let's try that. Let's try.
Randy, did you get yoga in today yet? Oh, you're muted.
No, I'm up north, so I'm doing the hiking reading thing.
Nice. I like it. Wait, how far north are you?
2 hours, but this is the.
Could we teleport?
Sure. I'm getting a taste of like what it's like where you and Blas are.
Yeah.
Rather than the desert. I was trying to look and see if I know I got the password when I clicked on the link, but I mean, I think that's what he needs, is that right?
Yeah, there's this Mighty Networks thing is not great. He's not in the community, and
Okay.
That has happened before where, let's try that. If you're not part of the community, then the link it sends you. Okay, let's see. I think I got it. Sorry for the delay here, y'all.
No worries.
Not at all. Yeah, shoot, it doesn't show me that anymore.
Yeah, it's not showing it to me either.
Okay. Let's see if that works. All right. Well, we'll get started a few minutes late. There are worse things. Yeah.
Gosh darn. What is it?
Yeah, Randy, you said up north. Where up north are you?
Oh, it's called Oak Creek Canyon. So it's like 20 minutes north of Sedona.
Okay.
Sedona is a red rock area, and then Oak Creek Canyon, it's just a small area where there's it's a canyon and there's just deciduous trees.
Okay.
A creek right here.
There's there's a place that I visited. I think it's in Oak Creek Canyon. It was in above Oak Creek. Have you heard of that? It's like a little hotel.
What's it called?
The Inn above Oak Creek.
It sounds familiar. I think I've seen it. It probably is. There's like it's a small place. Yeah, because there's a bunch of small places here.
Yeah.
This is called.
Hey man. All right.
How you doing?
Slight logistical details.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's on me. I apologize.
No problem at all. I'm great. Nice to see you.
Likewise. Dan, we have Randy and Jeannie on here. We might
have
a few more joining us, but as you probably heard with the robot voice when you joined, it is being recorded. So we'll share it with the community afterwards.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Dan, so let's dive right in, man. So look, for Jeannie and Randy's sake, I got to know Dan through Sean Delaney, who had him on the podcast maybe a month or two ago. Maybe you recorded earlier than that, but
I don't know,
something
blurs together a little bit.
Yeah. But Dan's story is amazing, and I think it's a really interesting segue with something we talk a lot about, at least in this community, with trying to bridge the the gap between theory and practice. And Dan has a huge amount of practice, and now it seems like he's trying to share what he's learned through a couple of different avenues. So Dan, if you're okay with it, maybe I just turn it over to you, not to cover what you already talked about with Sean or anything like that, but really quick overview of sort of your background. And I guess let's dive into the Emergency Mind project right after that.
Sure. So, hey, nice to meet you, folks. Happy to see you.
Likewise.
Absolutely. So my name is Dan. I live out in Los Angeles. I am. I guess for a long time, I'd start this introduction by saying that I'm an emergency doctor, which is certainly still true. So I'm a practicing emergency physician out at LA County, which is one of the busiest trauma centers on the West Coast of the US and arguably in the world. And then the sort of within that context, what I spend most of my time doing is thinking about how individuals, teams, and systems perform under pressure, and not just sort of under the generic pressure that most of us face all the time, but under these like ultra intense moments of absolute emergency, right? So how can I train my teams and my systems to be able to deliver our medical skill to the point where the patient needs us, which is in these, ultra high pressure, high uncertainty, high impact scenarios. And sort of within that context, I built the Emergency Mind project, which seeks to bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond in every field we can come up with about how to perform in those moments of emergencies. And I'm also, and actually this might be new since you and I talked last time, but I'm also recently named the Chief Medical Officer of the Mission Critical Teams Institute, which is sort of an international level think tank that does work with elite teams across military, NASA, sports, and everything else to try to think about how teams come together in these really crucial moments. So that's what I spend most of my time doing.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
That's wild. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, there are so many ways we can take this down. So why don't we, because it's so practical and I'm sure it's very much top of mind, as CMO of this group, like, how do you think about sharing those ideas with them? Is it, kind of one for one with Emergency Mind Project? Is it different because of the caliber of people you're dealing with? Like, walk us through how you're thinking about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's really different. So the Mission Critical Team Institute is all about mission critical teams, which sort of sounds ridiculous, but then you're like, okay, well, what actually is a mission critical team? Because not everything is a mission critical team. And they use a really high bar definition, which is small teams of usually less than 6 or 10 people who trained together to complete a specific mission that has life or catastrophic failure as part of its consequences, and that happens within a time frame, within a liminal space of 300 seconds or less, which is a very specific time frame, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is it's I think a really important piece of that, and this really does get back to sort of like where the Emergency Mind Project fits in all of this, is that you can be on a team that becomes, for a short period of time, a mission critical team, right? That you've trained for it. You do this one moment that is this mission critical moment, in the same way that as an emergency doctor, some of what I do within my shift will be an absolute emergency, and most of which won't, right? You go in and out of what in the mission critical sort of language is in and out of the extraordinary world, right? You're doing your normal stuff, and then you're doing this other thing, which is wildly different and has a completely different set of rules and different structures, different assumptions, different mental models you need to use to actually do it. And so that transition back and forth is certainly a point that we work on in both of those spaces. But a lot of what mission critical teams do is not emergencies, and not all emergencies are handled by mission critical teams. So, you have sort of like like the bug and the insect thing, like all insects are bugs, but not all bugs are insects. I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So why don't you walk us through maybe the differences between the two, right? So we take some of these principles as how to operate in very high pressure environments, and how that maybe translates to mission critical.
Yeah, and I think it's worth starting with like what seems on surface to be a very simple question, but actually really isn't, which is like, what is an emergency? Right? What is an emergency? Because most of the systems that we build and that we operate on, the mental models we're using, the stuff that you all are working on in lattice work, is not actually designed in any way, shape, or form to function during an emergency. And what you do outside of an emergency often has catastrophic failure when you put it into an emergency, and often vice versa as well. So for me, I tend to think of a couple of characteristics that define an actual emergency. So it is high pressure, meaning that when you look at the ratio of resources to requirements, you often have more requirements than you have resources to fill them. Now, usually that's time pressure that we talk about. That's sort of like the most common things, like it happens on a short time frame, but it doesn't really have to. It really just has to be an imbalance between resources and requirements. The second thing is that there's high impact to it, right? So if the consequence of not making a good decision or not executing a decision well is that you spill your coffee or you stub your toe, that's not really an emergency, right? Usually in my world, it's life or limb. In the world of the mission critical teams, it might be the success or failure of docking a ship with an International Space Station, which could have catastrophic consequences if we're not able to actually deliver those parts to the people that need them. The third thing is uncertainty. We have a wide level of uncertainty, and we have to be very comfortable in that uncertainty. But really, that's about it's like multi-layer uncertainty, right? So there's not just uncertainty about what the best choice is. Often there's uncertainty about what the problem is in and of itself. And you sort of stack those uncertainties on top of each other. And then you have to figure out how to make those decisions within them. We also have, similar to that is complexity, right? We have multiple parts that interact in non-linear and often unpredictable ways. With wild, higher order effects of magnitude in terms of what happens when they interact. And then the last piece is liminality, which is once you enter into an emergency, you cannot easily extract yourself from it, right? You can't walk into you can, but you shouldn't walk into a room where somebody is bleeding to death and sort of like creep your way back out because you're done here, right? Like, no, the person is in a hole and you have to get them out or through that hole, right? So those are the characteristics that we sort of work on. So pressure, impact, uncertainty, complexity, and liminality. And you combine those things together and you get this ultra volatile space that's prone to sort of move in multiple directions really quickly and unpredictably. It's also very fun and very rich, right? And an amazing space to sort of like leverage a lot of tools that are otherwise sort of slow, right? So when you think about when you take that ultra volatile environment and you mash onto it the idea of, say, the accumulation of marginal gains as a concept, right? Well, the little things that you do, these little marginal gains that you do, might make the entire difference between life or death when you smash them into an ultra volatile, rapidly changing scenario like that. So it's a really exciting space to be working.
Dan, how do you practice? So as sort of a corollary, I have a number of friends who surf, but they've turned to foiling just because the number of reps they can get is 10x or 100x what they can do because you're sort of at the whim of waves with surfing, but with the foil you can kind of get more reps there. All of those 5 factors must be pretty hard, maybe unless you're in the ER day to day, to find day after day. So how on earth do you practice those skills?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, right? So when we look at like what deliberate practice entails, you have this feedback loop, right? Where I think about it like, I often think about it like the build, measure, learn cycle of like the lean startup sort of standpoint, right? Like you have, or as a scientist, right? So I have a PhD in genetics, which we can get into or not get into, but the scientist point of view of, I have a hypothesis, I'm going to test that hypothesis, and here's how I know if that hypothesis worked or not. And then that cyclic learning to it is really important. Obviously as an ER doctor, I go up to bat against emergencies on a much higher frequency than most folks. And that is like, thankfully I do that, right? Like it's not like usually a fun thing to continue to go up to bat against emergencies like that. But there are pieces of it that anybody can train outside of being an emergency doctor, outside of being a mission critical team member, or outside of anything like that. And 2 concepts that sort of interplay with that. One is the concept of what we call the wedge, or applying graduated pressure to something, right? So if you imagine just like a simple like door jam style wedge, right? High wedge is the ultimate environment that you're going to be performing in. So it's life or death. It's like an actual trauma. Low wedge, by comparison, is any sort of simplified universe you've created to practice and hone your skills. Okay. And that can be either like naturally occurring or an artificially constructed simulation that you've done. So when I think about those components, you can build little pieces of them and you can find little pieces of them throughout your day, right? So I am stuck in traffic and I am late for a shift. Okay, that has some of the components of an emergency, right? It has pressure. I don't have the right set of resources. It has uncertainty because who the hell knows why traffic happens or where it's going, especially in LA, right? It has liminality. I cannot easily extract myself from the traffic. And it has some of the components of it. And so I can say, okay, like here is a scenario, which is a lower wedge version of what I'm about to do. And that's usually the terminology we use, low wedge versus high wedge practice. So I can find a space to do low wedge practice and I can start deploying some of the techniques I'm going to use that we can obviously get into in that scenario. And then you can also build those things, right? So every emergency training program has a sim capability, right? Where we have usually like, most of us have like high fidelity mannequins and sim labs that behave like people, and you're able to really get in there and sort of, you've got the monitors and you've got the beeping and you've got the people yelling at you and you've got stuff like that. But actually there's a lot of really fascinating work that's coming out now about low fidelity simulation as being an incredibly useful practice thing. So there's Victoria Brazel, who is this amazing physician out of Australia, and she talks a lot about what she calls the flat Maggie game, which is this amazing thing where it's basically just a paper drawing of a person who they have named Maggie, and they roll this paper out, put it on a bed and go, okay, Maggie's sick. What are you going to do? And then by everybody physically walking around in the space and talking to each other and sort of pantomiming the actions that they'd be doing, they're able to create a structure which has many of the pieces of an emergency without the obvious like risk to Maggie of us getting it wrong. It also allows us to really experiment more and sort of test other wilder ideas when we do it in a low wedge environment.
Amazing. I will look up flat Maggie. I love that idea of like,
pretty cool.
It's a piece of paper and it gets you some percentage of the results that you're looking for.
Right. And I think that that's a really crucial thing, which is that like, if you wait to only perform during emergencies, you will fail. Yep. You have to test and deploy and practice these skills in earlier, lower wedge environments before they're able to use in these higher wedge environments, right? Because otherwise, and like, not only will you fail, but you'll fail in a way that is not redeemable, in the sense that you won't know why you failed and you won't be able to get better at it, because maybe you failed because you don't know where the thing is that you have to find. Maybe you failed because you don't know how to use it. Maybe you failed because it's the wrong thing in general. But if you don't have enough of the structure around it, you're going to trip and you're not going to be sure why. And that's almost, for us in emergency medicine, that's almost the cardinal sin, right? Is to have something happen without being able to learn and evolve from it.
Such a good point. I think medicine and flight safety are two amazing areas to learn from, because one, it's mission critical to your point, but also the feedback loop to learn about what went wrong is so much more structured than it is in almost any area of life, right? So like, we failed at something, like maybe more so, I don't know, or at least people take it more seriously. You seem dubious, but what's your? Like,
well, I think that's one of the biggest. I was talking to this group from the Netherlands in the last day or two, and they had asked me, what do I think that one of the biggest barriers is to applying the ideas that the Emergency Mind Project works on? And one of my answers to that is actually the lack of a robust feedback loop in a lot of ways, because there's often, and if you look at like Anders Ericsson and the sort of deliberate practice model of stuff, right? Like to create a high quality feedback loop, you need a kind environment in some sense. Have you guys covered like kind? Okay, great. So like, you have to have a kind learning environment. Or you don't have to, but it's really helpful to have a kind learning environment so that you don't build in wrong habits and create wrong assumptions. You also have to have a really good way to sort of check in about like what's happening down the line, right? So unfortunately in emergency medicine, I might see a person do a set of actions and then the effect of those actions might not be visible for an extended period of time. And I might or might not be able to actually look at that and decide if that action I chose was the right action or not. So there are feedback loops in some sense, right? Like if you have a life-threatening tension pneumothorax, right, which is where air builds up in one side of the chest and it's compressing the heart and it's actually moving the trachea over, you have to cut their chest open immediately to relieve that air. And if you do it, there's a big whoosh of air and then their blood pressure gets better. So that's like a direct feedback mechanism, right? Like you have stabbed them, they are now better, right? Yeah. If they weren't better, then like now you have to move on to the next thing. But a lot of what we do doesn't behave like that. And there is this discontinuity in the system between what we do and what we see. There's this multifactorial complex nature to it. And it's often an unkind, if not antagonistic environment to be learning in. So I don't know, my answer is yes and no to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'd be curious how you think about progress or success, or how that's measured, right? I'm coming more from like a business angle, if you will, and you usually measure outputs because inputs are very hard, if not impossible to measure. So you take sort of the end output instead. How in your world do you kind of think about that, right? Is there some like common KPIs or anything like that, or should it be measured in a different way in your mind?
Yeah. So an important distinction to make before getting into that is the difference between performance and outcome, right? So I don't know if you guys have talked about this at all also, but if you look at like Annie Duke's like 2x2 table of performance and outcome, I think that's a really crucial way to think about it, right? So I control myself to a limited extent. I control the actions of my team and the structures around me. But there are times when somebody comes into my emergency department and their die has been cast and they die. And they die despite the actions, often the really high quality actions of my team and my staff. And so it's a common early error to measure your success by outcomes in that setting, because I am not omnipotent. I do not control who lives and dies, right? And so if I measured my ability based on that, I would be crushed and I wouldn't be able to come to work the next day. And the people that are there the next day need me to not think like that, right? Now, obviously, I want more people to survive and have less pain and less unnecessary suffering, right? That is, of course, my goal and the goal of my team. But you sort of have to temper that across this idea of which piece of this goal do you actually control. So sometimes you have standards that you can measure yourself against, right? So we think that through high quality, large scale studies that, for instance, if you have a broken bone that has cut the skin, you have an open fracture, we know that there's a mortality benefit to getting antibiotics of a certain kind to that person within an hour. Okay, great. That's a sort of like KPI style metric that we can be like, and we actually look at that. We look at what % of open fractures have antibiotics pushed within an hour. Okay, and those are like systems that we can sort of develop to tackle those subset of goals. The higher order stuff, and especially as you get into the more chaotic, more complex resuscitations, it's really challenging to create a set of metrics around that. One way that we try to sort of back end into that is by doing a really robust sort of debriefing process afterwards. And we have multiple layers of that. Because if there's no standardized and universally agreed upon metrics, then a proxy to that is you get the grayest haired people in the room together and you go, I don't know, what do you think? How was that? Right? You do it smarter than that, right? But essentially that's what you're doing is saying like, what do we think? And part of that is introspection. What did that feel like? Right? Like I'm just sort of stumbled across this thing actually in the last couple of days. The Johari window. You guys familiar with that one?
No, tell us about
it. It's another. I got one nod there. Awesome. So 2x2 matrix again with what I know and what I don't know, and what my team knows and what my team doesn't know. Right. So I'm going to maybe get this wrong because I'm literally sort of just learning this as we go, but it's a setup where what I know and what you know is in public domain, what's called the arena, right? What you know, but I don't know is my blind spot. Mm-hmm. What I know, but you don't, I'm hiding from you. And what nobody knows is the unknown universe. Yeah. Right. And so I think when you apply that sort of logic to how a team performs in an emergency, dissecting out what happened in a group with multiple points of view will definitely increase your ability to perform and improve your performance, right? Because there's so much that like you might see that I don't see, even if I'm the leader of the team. And coming back together afterwards is like a really crucial piece of that. That doesn't really get to your question about metrics, because I'm not sure that metrics exist in some of those spaces.
Yeah.
But I think that part of it's introspection, how did I feel? And part of it's externally, how did our team work together to get that done?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's a really good distinction. Again, process versus outcome. How robust or sophisticated is med school or residency or any other program sort of associated with your field in helping people think about these things like feedback loops? And you talk a lot about like micro moments and tensions and relax and release. Like, is this a lot that you had to figure out for yourself and kind of learn from other fields? Is it a part of the program in some formal way, or just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's challenging. I certainly can't speak for all of the different training programs out there. I think that some of these concepts I was introduced to in my training, and a lot more actually come from different universes as opposed to medicine. And this is a lot of the work that we do in the Mission Critical Team Institute. The historical way of training tacit knowledge, right? Knowledge that is like deep within you from repetition and training that you've developed, is essentially like, I can tell you, I know what right looks like, and I know what wrong looks like, but I have a really hard time teaching and expressing that. So the head of Mission Critical Teams Institute, Preston Klein, describes it as the suck less problem, right? Which is that like, I can tell you as a teacher that you suck and you should suck less. All right, good talk. And you sort of like move on to the next thing, right? And like in a lot of ways, that's actually how I was trained in medicine as well, right? I remember coming up and doing my first rotation in surgery and scrubbing into the OR for the first time, and and the surgeon being like, all right, scissors to med student, because they don't even know your name. And they give you the scissors and they're like, all right, cut this string. And, you go in and cut it. And the guy stops the entire operation. And just with this incredible string of expletives that I won't repeat right now, but I remember very distinctly, told me how sad the universe was that I'd been born. like everything that you could think of about like I didn't know how to hold scissors, which apparently I didn't. I was like the most useless thing to have ever been created, and that continued for a long time. Although actually, I see his point. I actually was holding the scissors wrong, but there probably was a better way to describe that. And I think some of our old school training was this apprentice model of watch. And it's the assumption that if you watch enough, you can pick up what this person has learned about how to do it. Because, I'm not the first ER doctor to think about performance under pressure. Hardly. All of us have to perform under pressure, right? I'm not the unique genius that's like, oh, this is sort of like, hey, now I've figured this out. What I've tried to do is to create a vocabulary that we can use to start making some of these concepts more explicit and to really dive into them more. And some of that comes not from medical training, but from other types of training, right? So if you look at some of the guests that I've had on my podcast, like Kristen Holmes, who is the VP of Human Performance at Whoop, and also a former like ultra Olympic level field hockey person, right? Like if you look at the way that she sets up her team for success, in a way, it's so much more sophisticated than what we have when we're starting an emergency training program. And so we're trying to bring a lot of those models into it. Now, when it succeeds, which it does way more often than that story that I just told you a second ago, right? Like most of the time we have a really high powered, robust education system where we do talk about skills, and we talk about the meta skills or the sometimes called the non-technical skills that it takes to really deliver those skills to the patient.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And learning through attack is maybe not the most useful way to always learn.
There are better ways. Now, there are times, especially in emergencies, where there is no space to be nice about something.
Yeah.
Right. Like we had a day recently when a patient came in cardiac arrest, and one of our juniors was not delivering CPR the way CPR needed to be delivered. And there was a moment where, you can tap them on the shoulder and be like, faster, and here's your rhythm. And if they don't get it, then you hip check them out of the way and take over, because there's no space for that. right?
Yeah.
Then afterwards, you can go back and debrief with them and be like, hey, what happened there? What did you think happened? Why do you think I bumped you out of the way? What do you think you could do better? How do you think that we could explain this in a way that makes more sense? How do you think you could teach your cohort what just happened so that none of that never happens to them? And you can sort of like use that as a moment to build off of it. But ultimately, the person needs CPR and you got to get it done.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dan. You have an example, I forget, either I read it or heard it somewhere, but in some emergency situation, you'll walk in and just ask who's in charge. And if nobody answers right away, you kind of step in. And the point you make is, look, there are certain behaviors and rituals that are important and necessary in emergencies, but they don't translate well to real life, right? Like if I walk into a normal room and do that, like social pariah, like that's very bizarre. Can you talk to us maybe about some of the mindsets, and maybe this is just emergency mind project, so maybe that's the segue, but talk to us a little bit about those mindsets, those behaviors that we can take to our day-to-day lives that will help us be better thinkers, better partners, higher performers in some way.
That you can take?
Yeah, that you can
Okay,
take.
great.
Yeah,
great. All right. Yeah, great. Right, because I would not recommend stabbing people in the chest on a normal basis.
That makes sense.
So yeah, I think that there's a lot, and I think that the more prepared you are to handle a crisis, the better you are outside of that. Right? The slower and calmer you can be when things are really in this emergency world, the slower and calmer and better you are outside of that too. And there's a ton of knock-on benefits for that. Let's take an example. Let's sort of back end into this. So it's June right now as we're recording this. And what happens in this time of June is the new doctors start. So these are folks that are just starting, they finished medical school and they're just about to be residents and they're coming in. And so a couple of days ago, I got a chance to work with our like brave and wonderful new cohort that's coming up. And what I did for an hour with them is talk about introspection, about what stress feels like, right? Because you guys know the Yerkes-Dodson curve?
No,
Cool.
at least
Okay.
I don't.
So imagine a bell curve. And the y-axis is performance on a skill, and the x-axis is stress. Technically sympathetic arousal, but let's call it stress, right? And what it says is that there's an optimal space. You want to have enough stress on board to perform at your best. If you don't have enough, you're bored and you don't perform very well. And if you have too much, you are fried and you don't perform very well. And so one of the big skills that we need to function in emergencies is recognizing where we are in this curve and learning how to shift towards the center, whether that's a right shift or a left shift, right? Maybe we come in, we don't have our coffee yet. It's the morning, we're like still stretching and, oh my God, there's a patient in cardiac arrest. You have to go from 0 to 100 right away, which has happened to me an uncountable number of times, right? Or you just had a cardiac arrest, there's another one, and you need to slow yourself back down and deliver the skills to the second person. Right. And either way, you have to learn how to shift. But the first part of that is introspection and figuring out where you are. So we go through these exercises with these new interns this past week about, well, what does stress feel like to you? Where do you feel it in your body? Is it tight? Is it loose? Is it hot? Is it cold? When you feel this, what do you do normally? Do you have a physical action you do? Do you say something? Do you lash out at somebody? Okay, well, what could you do that would make you 1 to 5% better at that? What experiment do you want to run this week in a low wedge environment that helps you understand where you are in that curve? And you don't even have to worry about shifting yet. Just pick where you are in that curve and recognize it. Maybe say it out loud to people, right? And if you mash that up with the Johari window, how do I show you that I'm stressed? How do I know that you're stressed, right? Everything I'm saying here is critical for team performance in an emergency, but hopefully, obviously, it's also really important for individual and group performance outside of that space, right? So if I'm thinking about, like a romantic partner, do I understand how to show them that I'm stressed in a safe way that doesn't involve lashing out? Can I feel that stress in myself and not need that feeling to go away, right? We had a couple of things happen in the last few days that I will not share the story of, but debriefing with folks afterwards, we kept coming back to the idea that I don't have to make this okay for me to be okay. Mm-hmm. right? I don't have to make this thing okay for me to be okay. And that skill, that being able to sit with the pain and suffering and discomfort, to feel the feelings on the inside and not need them to go away, that's an incredibly critical skill that translates between emergency practice and non-emergency practice. Especially when you start layering on communication and teams to that, right? So we're all, all of us together going to solve this project, but I'm really stressed out about something because, again, Johari window, I see something that you don't. Okay, well, am I able to communicate that in an effective way, or do I just run around screaming and flailing my hands, right? And all of that works outside of emergencies as well. So I think there's a ton.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love one more example in a second, if you're willing. And so just to make it personally how we've thought about this, Dan. So we have our oldest will turn 3 next week, and from an early age, we've kind of done these like very simple breathing exercises with her, right? And just like trying to help her label her feelings, right? So are you feeling angry or frustrated or stressed or annoyed? And there are 2 things that happened pretty recently that were just like amazing moments for us as parents, which is fun to see. But one is like, she came to us and just said, Mama, Papa, like, I need attention. I feel not neglected, but that's basically what she was saying. And like I couldn't ever imagine like telling my parents I need attention, right? It's like so vulnerable and like beautiful to us as parents. So like not have her passively aggressively just start crying or something, but like, I need love, like I need attention, please like help me out for a second. And a little bit before that, she was freaking out about something. And I walk over to her slowly. And usually the routine is, all right, her name is Sequoia. All right, Sequoia, let's take one deep breath together and then we'll talk. And as I was walking over, I see her take this deep breath by herself without me doing anything. And like those little, anyway, like I wish I had that growing up in a big way. And it's sort of like these universals where regardless if you're a parent or in ER or whatever, like introspection, self-awareness, labeling your feelings, knowing how you react to those things, and then communicating that with others, like, holy moly, that's like a super skill that is never taught, right? Like it falls into this bucket of like super important things that are never taught or talked about. So very, very cool example. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, we're trying to get those things more in the forefront of everything, right? At least in emergency training, because you have to be able to communicate with your team like that, right? Emergency medicine is a team sport, right? One of our axioms, one of our deep truths is that no matter how smart I am, the room is smarter than me. Right. The combined viewpoint set of everybody in this room is smarter and better than I am. And so it's my job to get everybody taking the same test, to get everybody focused on the same point, and to harness the wisdom of the room around me like that. And that's not possible unless I think through some of these other structures like we're describing.
Yeah. Makes so much sense. Like take the market. The market is smart, right? On aggregate and over time. And anyway. So Dan, you're obviously still very much in the practitioner seat, but with things like this project, it seems like you're at least progressing more so towards like the teacher role. Why do that now, right? Like why does now kind of feel the right time to step a little bit away from the practitioner side and more so to the teacher side? Maybe you've done it for a long time and it's just more formal with this project, but it'd be great to hear your perspective on that.
I think there's a way to answer that that's just practical reasons. But I think the more interesting answer is that I'm pointing myself in the direction where I feel irreplaceable. Right. And trying to figure out what I think the deepest work is that I am differentially useful at. And I think it's this.
Beautifully put, man. I love that. It's a little Naval quip, but like his line is you escape competition through authenticity. And like you want to productize yourself in some way too, right? And you can think of that as brand or whatever, but just very well put. That's very fun to hear about.
Yeah, I see a question there. Like, can I speak more about that and say more why about that? Yeah, absolutely. this is sort of a funny way to say it, but I've always been really fascinated about what I think about in the shower, right? Like when you're offloading your mind and you're not in the middle of something, when you wake up, what problems do you think about? What questions do you have about the universe? And for me, yeah, right.
The ambient thought, right?
Yeah, right. Like, what's your background process you're working on in the meantime? And for me, this has been that. Like, I started this road of thinking about human performance because I had these cases where I wasn't able to perform the way that I wanted to, right? I had all this medical knowledge, I had all this stuff, and I couldn't bridge the gap to get it to the patient in front of me. And I went home with a human being having suffered because I couldn't handle stress the right way. And that kind of blew my mind, right? I was like, well, why? Why does that happen? And that question over time progressed from, like, Dan, why can't you hack it? Which is like an ineffective and like not true question, right? to a much like broader question of like, well, geez, how do humans perform under pressure? Well, what's the best thing we know about how humans perform under pressure? And you sort of, you get to the edge of that, not like fairly quickly, right? Like we know some things, we have some ideas, but it's a really big open field where we're still trying to figure out how to do it. And as this is progressing, I'm doing more cases myself. I'm taking over more responsibility. We have graduated responsibility like that wedge. So I'm starting to run traumas and critical resuscitations myself. And I'm experimenting and I'm seeing the limits of my ability. And I know I need to get better. And you keep going. And, then I started, in a position here where I'm also teaching the next generation of ER doctors, because we always, almost all of us always teach to some degree as you're going forward. And I realized how much I wanted them to do better than I was able to do, and how much I wanted them to not stumble across the same things that I'd stumbled across. Right. So I wrote this book, The Emergency Mind, Wiring Your Brain for Performance Under Pressure, because it's what I wished I had when I started doing this. Because to me, it's the vocabulary, it's the words that we can start to use to build sentences and structures and everything else around that about how humans perform. And that is just such a deep, meaningful piece for me in terms of what I think I'm here for, right? What my purpose is, what I'm differentially good at. There are lots and lots of doctors that are amazing doctors. There are people who are just stunningly capable, brilliant clinicians who are able to calculate things that like I struggle with and try to figure out. And that's amazing. We can swap out and interchange in a particular shift, right? And you'll get phenomenal care, whether it's that person or me delivering the care. But some of these things, are where the magic happens for me, where I feel like I am differentially useful in some sense and able to really push the envelope quite a bit more. I hope that my hope is that when you build a book like this or something, like when you start this process, that everything I say is going to be so obvious and so obsolete and so useless, because like, of course, everybody trains with this now. That like, great, okay, now I got to go find something else to do, but that'd be awesome.
It's a worthy goal. It's like the Schopenhauer quote is something like, first they think you're crazy, then they laugh at you. I forget the progression from there, but eventually it becomes obvious that everybody accepts it as truth. So Dan, what and maybe I don't have the context, so if it doesn't ring a bell at all, we can move on. But in your discussion with Sean, you mentioned offhand really quickly what Dan 4.0 might look like. And you didn't talk about it at all. And again, if it doesn't spark anything in you, and that was an offhand comment or something, we can move on to something else. But if you do have sort of a version of like Dan 4.0 and what that looks like, it'd be fun to maybe learn more about that.
Yeah. Work in progress. I think, I think when you spend a lot of time in really intense, very challenging circumstances, you apply a lot of heat, you apply a lot of friction to yourself, and things change, things break, and things come back together. And sometimes that change is unconscious, and you either suffer through it or you just survive somehow stumbling, right? And sometimes you're able to sort of think about it ahead of time and use some structure and some space to try to evolve yourself a little bit. And I think that this whole like 4.0 concept started because I was thinking I was about to go on the Finding Mastery podcast with Mike Gervais. And I know he liked to ask people questions about sort of how they've evolved as a person. And I was like, oh my God, I got to think about how I've evolved as a person. But I come up with something smart to say. And actually, you know, so I was going on all these runs thinking about like, well, what has my life evolution been like? And it's sort of interestingly crystallized into these periods in some sense about, you know, based on these different sort of thought patterns and different sort of things I was doing. And you know, I think 3.0 was my residency training, you know, because you're just, this is all your life is. You're just in there in the hospital, like putting yourself to the grindstone over and over and over again. And you go through this massive amount of suffering and really hard things that you are not prepared for, because you can't actually totally prepare for it, right? Because you're going from one type of human to a different type of human, right? In some sense, you're crossing into this space where you're now, you know, we had a cardiac arrest the other day, and I was talking to one of my medical students afterwards, and we were discussing how it was the first time that she'd ever done CPR. And we were talking about how she felt and sort of like how she was recovering from it and the details of that. And at the end, I said something that I wish somebody had said to me when I was there, but now at least I can say it to everybody else, which is that, you know, you've crossed this invisible line between one part of humanity and another part of humanity. And now you're part of this small group of humans that has tried to deliver the best knowledge that we have as a species to keep somebody alive. We don't have a ritual for that, right? There's no like painting of faces or crossing an invisible line, but you have crossed a threshold between one type of human and another, and you will never be able to go back. You're now in this new space. And in a lot of ways, that's part of what residency training is, right? You cross over this invisible threshold from one part of humanity to another part of humanity. There is suffering associated with that.
Yeah.
I'll put that extremely mildly. And, you know, and sort of as you think about like evolving past that, like, you know, I tend to think of that being an incredibly powerful catalyst in my life, not just in my medical life, but in my life as a human, right? That exposure to stress and pressure and uncertainty is such a powerful catalyst if you allow it to change you. And I think that part of the 4.0 version is that recognition of like, that changed me. And now I get to question what I want to do next, right? So now I'm a lot more sort of self-aware than I was back then, as any of my friends I'm sure would tell you, and able to sort of approach that challenge of what comes next with a lot more joy.
Can you
kind
know
of a
what?
rambly answer, but
No, it's appropriate. Can you know what Dan 5.0 looks like? Is there some sort of model like that, or is it more emergent?
I don't know. You know, I'd hope smarter, more flexible, better looking than Dan 4.0.
all worthy aspirations.
I don't know. We'll see.
One of the last questions here, Dan.
Oh, happier also. Sorry, more fulfilled. I'll put that in.
Okay. Yeah, that's add that to the list. You had a question I've never had to really think of, but you gave a great example that I won't go into. But the question is, what do you owe those you're trying to serve? And I thought that was a beautiful thing to think of. And you didn't go into it too much with Sean, but I'd love to hear how you think of that, right? And just for quick context for people who might not remember or didn't listen, it's like, you know, you're trying to help save this person, or you know, they're in some traumatic situation and they're trying to bite you, they're trying to hurt you. What do you owe them? And I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's hard. I don't think that there's a simple answer to that. there's certainly no prescriptive way to do it. I think that there are, we can sort of explore that boundary of what right action is, or what best action is, or what action I want to take when I look back at myself. But it's hard sometimes to do that in the moment. And it's not obvious that there are right or best answers for a lot of these things. The other day I had a patient who came in, and I won't go into too many details, except that they, tried to claw me in the face as I was trying to help them. And that's not the first time that that's happened. It happens on a all too frequent basis. And you sort of wonder, like, well, what, as a human to human, what do I want for this person? How do I want to act in these scenarios? In a medical perspective, what do I want to be able to offer them? And from a community perspective, how do we really want that to work? And I think that those are really complex, deep questions that get to sort of some of the basics of, like, how do humans interact with each other and how should we interact with each other, right? And so, I don't know, a year or two ago, I had a young gentleman who was maybe in his early 20s and suffered from pretty severe cerebral palsy and wasn't communicative. And he bit me when I was trying to help him. And I remember being just so angry at this person had bit me that I was trying to help. And my immediate response was this anger and this flash of, like, real frustration, and then you sort of, like, take a step back and you're like, okay, well, this human being does not have the ability to express themselves in any other way. Right. And I don't know what it felt like for me to touch his shoulder, but that was the response that he generated. And like, can I be mad at him? Yeah, sure. Is that useful? No, probably not. Right. Yeah. And at the end of the day, is that what I want to reflect back on? That's how I responded to that? No, that's not the type of person that I want Dan to be. Right. I know this isn't that person's fault in some sense. So, okay, so what do I do with that? How do I process that? Okay, that's almost an easy case compared to, some of the other ones, right? Okay, well, what about a person who comes in who is, has a very serious addiction to drugs and is on a bunch of meth and tries to bite you? Is that person more or less, in large air quotes here, deserving of my anger than this other person? I don't know, man. I mean, I don't think that there's I don't think that there's universal answers to that. I know that I want to be the type of person that is able to buffer hardship and suffering and to return to the universe more peace than I was perhaps given. Mm-hmm. I also am the type of person that will strongly defend the people around me. And so my answer to somebody attacking me is very different than my answer to somebody going after part of my staff. Mm. But these are complicated questions for which there's no easy structural answer to it. Part of the joy and cost of working in critical environments is that you come face to face with questions that most folks don't have to wrestle with, but you do it in a real manner on a real time frame.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. That's beautiful. One thing I'd note, you're obviously very introspective, but it seems like a lot of your framework is also retrospective, where at the end of my life, how would I wish I would have acted in that moment? Yeah. That's powerful, right? It's a very useful way to kind of think of life. And like, would I regret behaving or doing this at this time? It might be hard to see in the moment, but 80-year-old Dan, 80-year-old Blas, maybe it's a little bit easier from that vantage point. So I don't know if you think of it like that, but it's definitely come up a few times so far.
Yeah. And I mean, and I've told this story once or twice across different forums, but I think it bears repeating, which is that is often an abstraction. Like, what if what do I want old man Dan to sort of think about some of this, right? But when COVID was starting, a lot of us just assumed that we would die. right? We didn't know what the death rate of it was going to be like, and we're exposed to it more than anyone. And we have the experience of our cohort that served in times of Ebola and stuff like that. And we didn't know, we just sort of assumed that like this might be it. And so, you take that thought of, well, what is the distant future me going to think about this, and smash that fast into maybe this is distant me.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what I get.
Yeah.
And I think that that's so poignant because we see that so often in the emergency department, right? When you come face to face with life or death like this all the time, right? Like I always think about the fact that the people that end up on the bed in front of me, like had plans for that next weekend. They have a thing they want to do, a place they want to visit, a book they've always wanted to read. And I'm sure in most cases, they didn't expect this to be the day that they get. And so coming more abruptly, to put that mildly, face to face with that idea, it really makes you think about, well, what do you think a day well lived is? What do you think that purpose looks like if this is the day that you get to reflect back on?
Beautifully put. It's such a luxury a lot of us live in kind of Western world, if you will, that a lot of those things have been abstracted from our day-to-day life. But there is something really powerful about coming up against it, and maybe not as abruptly and as violently as you all did in that scenario, but that reminder that life is short and to make the most of it. And Dan,
and we should plan for
please.
long things, right? Like we should plan for long things. We should expect to live long periods of time and have like beautiful futures that come out of the mist of the things ahead of us. Like I want that. I love that. But you also have to sort of piece this other chunk of it together.
Yeah. Dan, we'll obviously link to your book, the website, everything, but this community is relatively unique in that it's super broad, from investors to developers to growth marketing people, et cetera, et cetera. How can we serve you, right? How can we help you and your vision, and obviously believe deeply in what you're trying to get across and trying to teach? What can we do as a community to help you in some small way?
That's a great question. I think my answer and my challenge to that would be to like start deploying some of these ideas into your spaces, right? And see what resonates and what doesn't, and what works and what hits really hard and what sort of like needs a little bit of extra work, right? Because, but I really think that that if all of us could get better, and we can, at performing in times of emergency, then the ripples of that in all of our lives and in our community would be massive. Right. So that's the vision of the future that I have coming out of the mist like that, is this sense of all of us better able to perform in those moments. And as a result, being better teammates and partners and business partners and everything else to each other. So I would love to hear it. I'd love to hear about the emergencies that you're facing and how you handle them. And, did you try building a lower wedge version of your problem to try to tackle it, right? Did you think about introspection and the Yerkes-Dodson curve and how to move yourself back towards center? And how are you experimenting around that? Did you think about, the Johari window and expressing back and forth to each other about the details of what you're feeling and what you're not, and where somebody's blind spot is, and how is that working out in your day-to-day life?
Amazing. Dan, thank you for your time, man. This was awesome. Thank you for all that you're doing, for what you're sharing. It's a beautiful vision and mission. So thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, guys.
If you have time, Dan, or
yeah, fire away.
So I was thinking about something yesterday, and I thought of something when you talked about what you think about the shower. And what I get from this is that you, by being able to be objective, if I'm framing this correctly, as a patient, the thing that I would want from my ER doctors to be objective and say, look, there's things I can and can't do, and I'm going to make mistakes. Things are going to happen. But what I want from you is to come back every day and serve more people. And without that objectivity, you can't live with yourself. You can't do it. And that's the bigger purpose, is the fact that if you can teach that skill to other people, you have better functioning teams, you have more successful outcomes, and you have people that can handle a really difficult job. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that, in the sense that the better able we are to handle ourselves under pressure, the better service we are able to give to the rest of the people around us, both on that moment and then sequentially over time as we go from from one day and one case to another like that. Absolutely.
And can I just ask one question? I'd be fascinated if if on the spot, if you can come up with an example of how the voting 1 to 5 or questioning has ever resulted in a better outcome, or maybe didn't. Probably better, or it came out better outcome. You talk about where, where you're taking in others' opinions when.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
The fact that you're in charge. Yeah.
Right. So, like all the time, like all the time, it changes what we do. Yeah. A perfect example of this is that, in sort of a mundane, but actually very powerful example of it is, so let's say we have a person who comes in and they're in respiratory distress, they're not breathing well, and they're right on the fence between, they're not so dead that we know exactly what to do. They're sort of like that medium kind of dead where they're like about to be so dead, if that makes sense, right? Like the uncertainty really converges when you're already dead, because then like there's like less uncertainty and you just, you have your tools and you use them. So the quasi part's the really hard part. That's very morbid, I understand, but it's still. So there's a moment where they come in and they're really not breathing well. And there's therefore a very complex risk-benefit calculation about whether or not we should deliver anesthesia and put them on a breathing machine and a breathing tube. There's pros in that it might be able to help relieve some of their breathing problems, but there's cons in the sense that those medicines are very strong and have very complicated higher order effects on heart and lung physiology. And it's a non-zero risk procedure to do, that there's a chance it doesn't work. So you could make them much worse than they are right now, or you could make them much better. And that risk benefit calculation is ultra fast paced, very complicated, and full of uncertainty because you don't really know all of the features of it at any one point in time. One of the things that it takes to successfully deliver anesthesia and put somebody in a breathing tube is physically putting those drugs into the person. One of the things that takes is having a high quality IV line placed. All right. So most of the time in this scenario, I'm running the room and I'm running the calculation about whether or not to do this skill. And then I'm maybe actually doing the skill or backing up my junior doctor who's going to be the first operator on the skill. I'm probably not placing that IV line, which means I don't know if it's high quality or not. Right. So as part of what I'm doing is I'm doing our checks. When I say, okay, team, we're going to proceed with intubation. What I need now, does anybody see a reason not to go? And you look around the room, right? That's a quick version of sort of like the fist to 5, more complicated thing, but it's just an ultra like yes, no. But by the way, like calibrated to select for and request no answers to eliminate the hierarchical problems of somebody on my team counterdicting my order, right? I want that no, I want that safety check. So does anybody see a reason not to go? And one thing that will often happen is you'll get around the room and somebody will be like, I don't trust that IV. Phenomenal. Let's pause. We're going to place another one. We're going to slow the whole process down and get sufficient IV access before we go forward. Right? So there's an instance where somebody else had a vision of the universe that I didn't share, that I couldn't see, that I didn't know. But if we hadn't stopped, that might have, torpedoed our entire effort to actually get this person successful anesthesia and put them on a breathing machine. And the only way that you're really going to get that is by inviting those opinions in that moment right before. Does that make sense?
A lot of sense. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's fascinating and very beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, that happens like literally all the time. Like that exact scenario happens all the time. And there's more complicated versions of it, but I think that's like a really straightforward, like if there's another person on your team that has optics on a piece of the process that you don't own, like, are they able to feed that information to you effectively? Which speaks to like all of the invisible stuff that it takes to ask that question. Are you building a psychologically safe culture? Do you have open lines of communication? Do you have an ability to pass information back and forth in a way where people feel supported when they do that? Like, do you understand how to ask that question well? There's like skill upon skill upon skill to actually do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Dan, thank you again. We'll let you run here, but sincerely, it was great to learn from you. Appreciate your
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye,
Y'all take care.
Bye.